I want to introduce our next group, Labor and Gender Rights. So to my left, we have Meera Santhanam from the University of Chicago. She was selected as our Gender Fellow, and she is reporting on feminist filmmakers. Laura Goodfield from GW, also a Gender Fellow, reporting on gendered mobility in Berlin. And Elisa Agosto from Guttman Community College, activism to empower Latina women in New York's cleaning industry. And Cole McCann Phillips, a Gender Fellow from University of Pennsylvania, who is going to report on Lebanon's trapped domestic workers. You'll see Akil Starks is on the schedule, but he was not able to make it. So we'll go ahead and start with Meera. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Meera. I am at the University of Chicago, Gender Reporting Fellow, and I'm going to be talking to you all about my reporting in Beirut, Lebanon, where I reported on women filmmakers across Lebanon, but mostly focused in Beirut. And this is a picture I took at the premiere of Costa Brava, Lebanon, which is a film about the environmental crisis in Lebanon, and was directed by Elisa Agosto. I was really excited about to attend the premiere in downtown Beirut. So before I get into the nitty-gritty of the actual films in Lebanon, I think it's important to talk about the role of crisis in modern Lebanon today. So I actually arrived in Lebanon on August 4th, 2022, and that is the 2-year anniversary of the Beirut blast. And for those who are unfamiliar, the Beirut blast was an explosion of ammonium nitrate housed at the port of Beirut that tragically killed over 218 people and wounded 7,000 others. And there's really been a complete lack of justice or accountability, specifically a lack of justice for the victims and their families. And so the day I arrived in Beirut, I actually went to the streets, went downtown, and saw the protests taking place. So you have to understand sort of this context of the blast and the lack of justice for the victims, because they're present really across all of the films that I watched. There's also a garbage crisis in modern Lebanon, a financial crisis, and obviously the effects of COVID-19. Lebanon was recently ranked the 2nd saddest country in the world, and so I think understanding the role of the blast in public consciousness is crucial before I talk about my reporting. So while there is crisis, obviously, in Lebanon today, Lebanon is also a place of immense hope. As you can see, there are people laughing in outdoor cafes under string lights. People are visiting art galleries, enjoying their time by the beautiful Mediterranean. They're protesting. That sign in Arabic on the left says El Quwa El Nas, which means power of the people. They're enjoying the bustling streets of Hamra. So it is a place of hope at the same time, despite the effects of the myriad of crises that I talked about already. So I chose to interview 6 different feminist filmmakers in Beirut. You can see all of them here. Some of them are documentary filmmakers, some are making works of fiction. And for the article that I published both in the Pulitzer Center website, but also in the Middle East Eye, I chose to focus on Zainab Nakash in the upper left, and I'm going to talk about her story a little bit more in a second. So the films that these filmmakers are making are kind of challenging common perceptions about what Middle Eastern films look like, and that is why I chose to interview these particular individuals. There's a common misconception that films about the Middle East tend to focus only on war and conflict, and I wanted to challenge that. So these filmmakers are talking about love stories, they're talking about humor, everyday moments of life, slice-of-life documentaries that aren't just about shootings and violence and conflict. And at the same time, there's a misconception that women in the Middle East are oppressed and that films only demonstrate that. These women are challenging that misconception. They describe themselves as feeling liberated, and their female protagonists in their films as feeling liberated as well. As you can see, their films span everything from documentaries about jellyfish to a movie about the environmental crisis in Lebanon, through the intricate family dynamics of one family that escaped Beirut, to the story of an outsider who is cast as a Lakit in Lebanese society, protests at the American University of Beirut during the student revolution, or a love story when a woman from the East meets a man from the West. all of these stories are not just about conflict, and they don't just portray women as repressed. Sorry, one moment. So I chose to focus on Zeina Dakash for my article, and she is a trained actress who then went to the US, became a drama therapist, and returned to Lebanon and actually decided she was tired of the conventional theater world. She wanted to introduce drama therapy into Lebanese prisons and start working with marginalized populations in Lebanon. In other words, she was tired of theater only for the elite. So what Zeina did is she got permission actually to conduct drama therapy workshops inside of Lebanese prisons. And not only held these workshops, but also choreographed plays put on entirely by the inmates. So in her first play, called 12 Angry Lebanese, a take on 12 Angry Men, she worked with men incarcerated at Roumieh prison, and then made a documentary about the whole process of making the play called 12 Angry Lebanese. And in her second project, she worked with women in Babda prison, which is the only women's prison in Lebanon, where she worked with domestic violence survivors and had them put on a play as well, where they told their own stories through monologues and more. So most recently, Zeina made another film called The Blue Inmates, and that centers on her drama therapy work, again in Roumieh prison, but this time with inmates suffering from mental illness. So there's a building inside of Roumieh prison called the Blue Building, and that building is designated only for those inmates suffering from mental illness. And the Lebanese Penal Code to this day states that any, quote, insane, mad, or possessed offender shall be incarcerated until cured. So what this means is that anybody suffering from mental illness in Lebanon effectively gets a life sentence because of this anachronism in the penal code that says that they have to be incarcerated until they're cured, right? Nobody's checking to see if they're cured, and science tells us that mental illness can be managed, not cured. So Zeina was appalled by this and wanted to work with mentally ill prisoners and actually started bringing drama therapy into the Blue Building. And one of the folks in her documentary actually said, look, the persons here have an unknown fate. The penal code stipulates that they'll be sentenced to a psychiatry unit until cured. First, they won't be cured. Second, no one's checking if they're cured. It means they're serving a life sentence. So Dakash started working with inmates in the Blue Building, introduced drama therapy. Unfortunately, the inmates suffering from mental illness weren't able to act in the final play because of the prison's restrictions. So instead, she had convicts in Unit A basically tell the stories of the mentally ill inmates. And she was really sick of theater for the elite and instead wanted to, again, as I said earlier, bring drama therapy to marginalized groups. She's not only worked with prisoners, but worked with at-risk youth in Lebanon, those in psychiatric hospitals, kids in the streets, refugees, domestic violence survivors. So she's really trying to bring theater to a whole swath of people. So just a couple more slides here. So Zeina has actually worked to reform the Lebanese Penal Code through her work. So there's a basically Law 463, which was known as the Early Release Law, that allows for people to be released early from prison on the condition of good behavior. That was actually implemented a month after the first performance she choreographed in prison. So she is changing the law through her work. Her second play led to the implementation of a law that protects women who are survivors of domestic violence, and her latest efforts working in the Blue Building actually led to 2 draft laws that aim to create better legislation for those who are mentally ill and in prison. And so a couple takeaways I want you all to have. First is that Lebanon's film industry is led by women. 50% of filmmakers in Lebanon are women, compared to a paltry 5% in the US. You can't talk about film in Lebanon without talking about the role of crisis today, but at the same time, Lebanon is a place of hope. Theater can live in unexpected places, as we see by the theater she conducted in prisons, but also in the streets and in hospitals and in all kinds of places. So thank you all so much for listening. I want to share my article with you. If you all would like to read it, you can scan the QR code. I published the final story in the Pulitzer Center, but also with the Middle East Eye. So thank you all so much for listening.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. My name is Laura Goodfield, and I am from the George Washington University right here in DC. I am a BS MPH student, And this past spring, I spent some time in Berlin, Germany, doing research for my Pulitzer project. So for my fellow city dwellers or public transportation users, or really anyone in the audience, raise your hand if you think public transportation is designed for women. No hands. Same. Great. There are a lot of factors that go into making using public transportation as a marginalized gender identity not particularly enjoyable, whether that is just general safety concerns, harassment, accessibility issues. The list really goes on. But if you think about it, this idea is a little bit backwards because around the world, women are the primary users of public transportation. Conversely, men are the primary users of private vehicles. And gender divides within mobility also exist in spatial patterns of travel. So research shows that throughout the day, men really only take one major journey from point A to B, whereas women undergo multiple trips to multiple different distances or destinations, but are smaller in distance. And a lot of this in Germany does have to do with employment. So women who are employed are more likely to work part-time than full-time, and these numbers only increase if you are in a household with children. And these employment patterns mean that a lot of times household errands, care work, taking care of other family members, elderly members, and just the general errands of day-to-day life fall on women's shoulders. So this graphic is an example of some of those patterns, say, in a two-parent household in Germany, where men might use the family car, if they do have a car, to travel to and from work, whereas women might undergo, again, these multiple destinations using bikes, walking, bus, tram, train, etc. But barely anyone here, well, no one here thought that public transportation was designed for women. So this is really the issue that I wanted to explore in my project. How can we bridge the disconnect between urban designers and local government and really get them to connect to public transportation's most loyal users? During my time in Berlin, I identified mothers of young children as a group that had most of their needs unmet by the current public transportation system. One mother, Alina, has a 4-year-old and is pregnant with her second child. And she finds that a lot of her issues accessing public transportation have to do with the infrastructure of the station itself, especially when she's traveling with a stroller and will soon be traveling with a baby in a stroller and also a young child by her side. And while this specific example may sound sort of banal, it's the frustrating reality for many in Germany. In 2020, the Berlin Senate approved a plan that would allot 28.1 billion euros towards new train and tram cars, expanding the existing routes of the trains, and also improving the infrastructure of, again, the trains and the stations. But things have seemingly gotten worse for people like Alina. This is a picture of one of the tram cars in Berlin, and she mentioned that in one of these newly designed train cars, the open space for the stroller was actually taken away. And now it's kind of a flex space within the new train cars where you have fold-down chairs in there, and during rush hour, Alina notes that her only choice really is to just kind of roll around in the middle of the train or tram with her stroller, or ask people who have been sitting down to get up. So perhaps the solution is to make public transportation everyone's primary mode of transport. And this is the goal of Volksentscheid Autofrei Berlin, or the People's Car-Free Berlin referendum. They're a grassroots organization that seeks to ban private car use in the inner circle of this map, so everything in the A zone, which includes the heart of downtown Berlin and is 34 square miles. For reference, this is about half the size of all of DC and pretty much the entire campus of Disney World Orlando. Berlin's referendum, Autofrei, really wants to just create a better life by transitioning streets like this one in downtown Berlin, which seemingly looks fine. You know, you have a tram line running through, you have sidewalks, place to park your bikes, pretty advanced compared to an American city, yet they want to transform it into a pedestrian-dominant streetscape as opposed to the car-dominant one. One thing that Autofrei really believes in is a sustainable city needs more space for pedestrians, cyclists, and a strong public transport system. And they also tout other benefits to a car-free city, for example, better health, greater climate protection, and all around better quality of life. Autofrei also acknowledges that another indirect benefit to their plan could bring about greater gender equality within transport. I spoke with public transportation engineering consultant Lika Ipma, who agreed that this outcome was entirely possible. If cars are banned, public transport will automatically be prioritized, meaning more trains scheduled at tighter intervals, and punctuality is twice as important for people who take care of kids. More transportation users in general could force the city to maintain its existing infrastructure, like the station elevators Alina relies so heavily upon. And while perceived safety on public transportation is a whole different presentation, perhaps an increase of users at off-rush times could contribute to a little bit more safety, feeling of safety for women using public transportation, especially at night. Whether Autofrei's referendum will pass or not, there is still an ongoing struggle to make Berlin's public transportation system more usable and accessible by women, especially mothers and caregivers. Nevertheless, the process to make Berlin more livable for all requires both citizens and lawmakers alike to be on board. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Elisa Agosto, and a little bit about me is that I just recently graduated from Guttman Community College, where I was studying information technology. Now I'm going to John Jay doing computer science. And during the summer, I was able to look at how an activist group in Brooklyn is empowering Latina cleaning workers. Oh, sorry. So for today's agenda, we're going to be going over who's involved, where is this happening, what is their mission, how is support being offered, and final project takeaways. Before we begin, I want to give a thanks to my professor, Rosalia Reyes, who was a great mentor and guide throughout this whole project. This is my first journal piece, so she was a great expert who I could turn to and get really great advice from, so thank you to her. Proyecta Justicia Laboral is located in Marcian Division in Brooklyn, New York, or in English, it's known as the Labor Justice Project. This organization was founded in 2010 and has a total of about 12,000 people. They have multiple locations across New York, and so they really cover all types of backgrounds of undocumented immigrants who come to America. However, this particular location in Marcian Division focuses on Latina women. So at this location, there are about 50 women who are members of the organization. And while doing my project, I was able to work closely with Director Maria Valdez. And through my conversations with her, she really emphasized bringing pride and dignity to the work that these women are doing. Their focus has always been to prevent the exploitation of undocumented workers through education and empowerment. This means knowing and defending their rights. I understand it's not easy to let an insider into a vulnerable situation, but they did, and I hope to garner the attention that this organization and the women deserve. So this first picture is showing the physical location of La Parada, or the street where the women are staying. The exploitation of these workers have been evident across New York, and It's been here for decades, and I know this because my family immigrated from the Dominican Republic to Marcy Avenue. And when I was explaining my project to them, they recalled that women have been waiting at La Parada forever since they were growing up. And so this image, if you could see, was taken in 2009. And I wanted to bring this up to show to light that not much has changed in the conditions that these women are still standing outside, whether it's winter, fall, summer, spring, waiting for work. This goes to show that these women aren't going anywhere, and there's a growing need of services to protect the women coming in and out of La Parada. The New York State minimum wage is $15 an hour, and that's been established since 2018. When I was having an interview with the women, they explained to me that even though this is a law that it's $15 an hour, they felt lucky if they were offered between $8 and $12 an hour. After joining the organization, they've gained confidence to demand their rights and to keep their dignity. These are some pictures of their outreach methods. So on the top left, you could see a pamphlet that gives instructions on how to get better working conditions. On the bottom right, you could see two women with the Liberty Cleaners on their shirt, that because the location of the Justice Labor Project is so close to La Parada, these women were able to simply just walk up to the women and explain what they do, and this has worked for them in the past. A lot of these women only know of harsh cleaning products, but this organization has come together to create organic, safe, and effective products. Meetings are held all throughout the month, and it allows women to create something that is of value to their everyday lives. This is a picture of the women packaging and prepping small amounts of their homemade product. It's moments like this that really show the community and dedication that these women put into their lives. The organization is now trying to focus on getting credible recognition to elevate their organization. New York State Senator Julia Salazar came in and was able to come to the district and hand out awards to show and motivate the women that what they do is truly inspirational. When I spoke with Julia, she admitted that work needs to be done, especially after the lack of support during COVID. Because of this awareness in the government level, the Excluded Workers Fund was made to give back to the undocumented workers who were excluded during COVID. So this picture is of one of their English classes that I was able to attend. These women have certain words and questions and phrases written out in a way where they could easily say it and understand it. And so, with the classes, they're about like an hour long, and I was able to witness about three or four of them. And so it's their patience and dedication that really allows them to adapt to their new life here in New York and really thrive for them and their families. So for the project's takeaways, it's about community, uplifting each other and becoming a force. With pride, these women deserve recognition and the work that they're doing. And with dedication, these women are spending hours of their life for a better opportunity for them and their children. Thank you, everyone. I have a LinkedIn QR code if you guys would like to scan it, and if it doesn't work, I'm so sorry, but Elisa Agosto. Thank you.
Hi guys, I'm Cole. I spent 3.5 months this past spring in Beirut, Lebanon, working closely with the Kenyan community of migrant domestic workers to understand how they were navigating the process of being able to be repatriated back to Kenya and return to their home to flee what is a collapsing economic situation. So in order to understand how this system is functioning and how this came to be, we have to understand the kafala system. The kafala system is not new, and it is not unique to Lebanon. It is a system that has been described as contract slavery. It exists based on asymmetrical information exchange networks and networks of formal and informal human trafficking that have been established from the developing world to rich countries in the Middle East. It allows for employers to exploit the labor of workers that they bring into their homes, and it injects women from developing countries into a highly racialized system of oppression. In Lebanon, it has, especially following their economic collapse, it has created an untenable situation for hundreds of thousands of women who are trapped in what is a collapsing economy, in what is a collapsing social structure. And these women have begun to stand up against the systems of their own oppression. These are photos from May Day protests that happened even before the economic collapse. The sentiment in Lebanon has only gotten worse over the course of the last 3 years. The Lebanese economic collapse began in 2019 with the October 17th revolution. The currency collapsed, their entire economy lost almost all of its viability overnight. And this meant that hundreds of thousands of families who were employing migrant domestic workers in their homes were no longer able to pay their salaries. This is a video of the October 17th revolution, and it shows a migrant domestic worker protesting from the balcony, joining the people of Beirut in their goal of uplifting themselves and gaining independence from a corrupt sectarian government. The COVID-19 crisis kicked the suffering and oppression of migrant domestic workers into overdrive. As the economy continued to collapse and as Lebanese families were not able to pay the salaries of their migrant domestic workers, thousands were thrown onto the streets of Lebanon with no way to be able to support themselves, their families, and send the remittances back home to their families in the countries that they were from. They also were unable to leave. The Lebanese airport, the Rafik Hariri airport in Beirut, was completely shut. So thousands and thousands of women lived on the streets of Beirut with no way out. This led to incredible popular sentiment among ethnic communities of migrant domestic workers who sought to bring their diplomatic representation to task, to ensure that their representatives were working as hard as they possibly could to ensure that they were able to return to the safety of their homes, of their home countries. After the Beirut explosion on August 4th, 2020, the Lebanese psyche and the psyche of Beirut was dealt an irreparable blow. And it led to mass popular uprisings, similar to that of the 2019 revolution. This is where I came into this story. I saw how dozens of women had organized protests outside of their diplomatic representations. And I saw that these women who were navigating illegal statuses, who had no ability to gain the employment and have the money to be able to support themselves, were standing up against the system. They were being incredibly brave. But what I didn't understand was how women who were fleeing their employment or who were being kicked out onto the streets were able to support themselves. How were they able to feed themselves during this period of time between escaping employment and being able to secure repatriation, which is sometimes as long as 6 to 9 months. So I was able to establish contacts with leaders of the Kenyan community, women who had been in Beirut for years and had figured out the Lebanese economy, had learned Arabic, and were working as freelance workers. So they were doing hair, they were cleaning houses, they were operating as physical therapists. I saw how these women had used the space of protests outside of their embassies to come together as a community and build networks of informal support. That these women who were facing so many problems in their daily lives, who every day were waking up wondering whether they were going to be able to put food on their own table and pay their own rent, pay their own generator bill, were opening their homes to dozens of women who had recently arrived to Lebanon and had way fewer resources than them. I was lucky to be invited into these homes on multiple occasions and speak with women who had undergone some of the most distressing treatment imaginable and were just simply waiting to be repatriated back to their home country of Kenya. I was able to see how they practiced resilience and how they lived a day-to-day life of uncertainty and fear. The other thing that I saw was that life goes on, that in these households where 9 women would sleep together in a single room, where they were struggling with food, where they were struggling with heating, where they couldn't turn on the lights, they were laughing, they were dancing, they were playing music. Life was going on. They were ensuring that they were serving as each other's support system and making sure that they were able to survive. Ultimately, the goal of all of the women that I spoke to was being able to go home, to reunite with their families, to be in a country that viewed them as a human being, that viewed them how they deserve to be perceived, and they wanted to be able to put this horrible experience in the rearview mirror. Thank you guys very much, and I'm excited to. Should I?
Hey, thank you all. Did a great job. And it was fascinating to learn about intersections between different projects that you did related to gender and to labor. Let's go to questions now. Do you have any for each other? Anybody?
I can start.
Sure, great.
For Cole, what was the main challenge for these women going back to Kenya? Was it they were having trouble putting together financial means, or was there, conflict between embassies, like a government type issue? Like, what were the different barriers?
Is this on? Yeah, great. So it's a really important question, and it's a huge mosaic of obstacles that these women are facing. One of the primary obstacles is that it is common practice in Lebanon and across the Middle East for migrant domestic workers to have their passports taken upon arrival. So if an employer is not willing to let their employee leave, they don't have a passport. You can't really travel without a passport. Even when they were able to secure laissez-passer documents from their embassies, the Lebanese system, the Lebanese legal system, is set up so that it is quite difficult to leave Lebanon without the approval of your sponsor. So many women that I knew were fleeing abusive workplace environments or had horrible relationships with their sponsor, and were not able to secure that. So it would take up to 9 months to be able to actually get that authorization to be able to travel. The International Organization for Migration actually offered and was paying for tickets for any woman to leave Lebanon, but the social and judicial barriers to being able to leave were so insurmountable that it became very difficult. And the women that I was working with, these Kenyan women who had been in Lebanon for a long time and were helping women through this process, were acting as informal experts. I mean, they knew how to navigate the system, and they were helping women who were less knowledgeable and had fewer resources than themselves.
I also have a question for you, Cole, if that's all right. So did you find that, like when I was in Lebanon, I noticed that at a lot of the restaurants, there were, for instance, Syrian waiters or Palestinian waiters, Syrians having fled the Assad regime, right? And Palestinians also there as refugees, in large part. I know your project focused on the experience of Kenyan women specifically, but some of the Syrian waiters I talked to, for instance, described feelings of resentment from Lebanese, this kind of idea of, why are you here taking our jobs? And they also described
that same kind of resentment vis-a-vis other migrant workers. So sort of the sense of competition perhaps between migrant workers from Africa and refugees from Syria and Palestine. So did you observe any kind of forms of like solidarity between, say, Palestinian refugees and Syrian refugees working throughout Lebanon and then migrant workers from Kenya? And what did those forms of solidarity look like?
So that's a very interesting question. And I think that it would be a very interesting project to explore more in the future. One of the things that I did notice was much of the solidarity was down to like ethnic and linguistic groups. So one of the major obstacles for migrant domestic workers that I noticed was that they weren't able to speak Arabic and found it very difficult to engage in Lebanese society and explore the resources that are available for people in Lebanon. So many of them would stick within their own national groups. There were a lot of organizations that were working to kind of expand the networks of solidarity, but no, I didn't really notice any significant solidarity efforts between Palestinians and Syrians.
Okay, want to see if you all have questions. Good, you do. And just while it's on my mind, I want to remind everybody that Cole's audio and Elisa's video are in the resource tab of the wiki page. So if you want to look later, please do.
Hi, I had a question. Okay. Great presentations, everyone. I had a question for Laura. I learned a lot from your presentation, and having spent time in Berlin, which I think is like the pinnacle of public transportation, I was wondering if you if you have any lessons learned that could be applied to other, contexts, like the U.S., for example. I mean, I noticed you live in D.C., so how does that affect kind of your experience riding the metro? And do you think similar policies or even initiatives could be advanced in other contexts, as well as others in Europe? I'd be curious to hear what you found.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the main struggles that I found, especially for women in Berlin, and I lived there for 4 months doing this project, so I got to know the transportation system pretty intimately. But similar to how it is in the US, a lot of the major stops on the above-ground subway, the underground train, trams, they really link points of business together. And once you factor also points of interest like tourism, that really can structure a public transportation system, meaning there's not a lot of connection to neighborhoods outside of the downtown area. So I grew up in Boston, America's oldest subway system as well, and that's an issue we see there as well. Also in DC, if you look at the metro map anytime this weekend, most of the connections happen in federal buildings in that area, or again going to monuments. But when you try and take public transportation here in the Adams-Morgan area, you're going to see that the red line really just stops at DuPont and is not bridging together residential neighborhoods. It's really only connecting certain residential neighborhoods to those places of commerce, places of interest, etc. And Berlin is trying to expand that with the tram system. So that's, the above ground kind of electric cars or rail cars. But there is still, a disconnect between the citizens and people in local government where, if you need to go to the neighborhood right next to you for the grocery store, oftentimes you're taking the train to go into that, hub and then go back up when really it was a 10-minute drive, but now you've extended your trip by 45 minutes. And that was one of the main issues that the women I spoke to had. So even though Berlin is trying to improve that and the situation is worse here in the US, I think moving forward, that's going to be a key differentiator in making public transportation more accessible for everyday people in the city.
My question is for Cole. Thank you all of you for your presentations. Cole, were you able to speak to people who are on the other side of the kafala system who sort of benefit from having this system in place? And do you see them also, or sections of them, advocating for better improve systems for the people who are coming, for the workers who are coming, the women who are serving as domestic workers in Lebanon? And if you could answer that, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, so the presence of migrant domestic workers and families in Lebanon is so ubiquitous that most Lebanese people that I spoke to grew up with a migrant domestic worker living in their home. And I openly talked about my project with them. Most people wanted to hear what the heck I was doing in Lebanon. And the thing that was very fascinating to me was, in speaking to my friends, the most common refrain was, it's so horrible what some Lebanese people do to their migrant domestic worker. It's an atrocity. We treated our migrant domestic worker, our maid, really well. She ate at our dining room table. She was a part of the family, but so many other people treat them like animals. And there is this interesting cognitive dissonance to me between this understanding of the ways that the system can go wrong, but not seeing it as being inherent to the system. As an outsider, I do see it as inherent to the system. I don't think that there's a way of having labor that's tied to a person that isn't gonna create an exploitative condition. But definitely, interacting with people, they understand the issues with the system, and they want to make life better for people, but they also want to preserve their dominance within the hierarchy.
Thank you all for your presentations. My question is for Meera. For the incarceration until cured, I was just wondering, how do they define insanity? Does it have to be a medical diagnosis? And then also, have you seen that affect society's perception of mental health and how it's talked about?
Yeah, so great question. So it's actually a really anachronistic, right, article in the penal code because it uses the language insane, mad, or possessed. It doesn't say people suffering from mental illness. So one of Zaina's big calls to action was we need to change the language in the penal code to say people suffering from mental illness, right, not insane, mad, or possessed. So to your question, it doesn't define insane. It doesn't define mad. It doesn't define possessed. And so what this functionally means is that these people incarcerated at Roumieh prison in Lebanon are there for life because nobody's going in and checking if they're cured. There are no, while there are occasional psychiatrists and therapists who will make visits into the prisons, there's no formal evaluation system to say, okay, can this person be released now? And as Zaina rightly pointed out, science tells us that mental illness is most often managed, not cured. So what this means is that it's basically a sentence for life. Very few people who are incarcerated at the Blue Building have been released. And the only ones who have largely been released because of the activism surrounding Zaina's documentary. So Itani, for instance, who's on the poster for The Blue Inmates, the film, he was released, but only because the film galvanized so much activism and energy that judges in Lebanon were basically forced to reckon with the fact that, okay, this person was incarcerated for petty theft, is spending his entire life in prison because of this anachronism. We have to do something about it. But it really calls for a language change. They can't be calling them insane, mad, or possessed anymore, and they have to get rid of that until cured clause. So thank you for the question.
Hi, my question is also for Meera. It's about process. So first of all, that statistic you shared was shocking about, I forget how many, 5% of women?
5% in the US, yeah.
US and 50 in Lebanon. So first part of the question is that the statistic that brought you to this story, and specifically Lebanon? Because there are women filmmakers everywhere. And second is you were writing a story about people who are making stories. How is striking that balance as a journalist? Were any toes stepped on?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think the statistic was part of the reason that I came, but I actually uncovered it somewhat late in my reporting. I knew largely that there were many more women filmmakers in Lebanon and Palestine than in the West, and I wondered why. One of the answers people gave me was that the industry is relatively newer in the Levant, and so because of it, it reflects this more modern ideology that's more inclusive. But to be frank, it was really that through my Arabic classes and formal Arabic training, I'd been introduced to cinema from the Middle East, and I had watched a lot of these films by this director named Nadine Lebeki. She's probably the most famous Lebanese filmmaker out there, and she's also widely known in the West. Her film, Capernaum, was actually Oscar nominated. It's been criticized, some have actually called it poverty porn, but it's also brought a lot of awareness to filmmaking in Lebanon. So I'd seen her film Capernaum, I'd heard that it went to Cannes, that it was nominated for an Oscar, and I started watching all of her other films and really kind of fell in love with Lebanese cinema on a personal level. So I think that was the impetus that really brought me to Lebanon, and then later I came to learn about, well, why is this, disparity so staggering? Because it is, right? 50% in Lebanon and Palestine compared to 5% in the US is quite shocking. And I think your second question is also really interesting, right? Like, what is it like being a storyteller who's interviewing other storytellers? And right, Zaina at least was storytelling on so many levels. She was storytelling about what are the lives like of these inmates incarcerated at Roumieh, but also how do I make a documentary that talks about that? So she was both a filmmaker, a theater director, a therapist, right? All of these hats at the same time. And I think what I learned that in order to be an effective storyteller, I can't just watch from the outside, I actually have to participate. So Zaina extended an invitation for me to come and sit in on one of the drama therapy sessions and actually be, I guess, therapized myself. And so at first I said, okay, well that sounds kind of weird. I'm a journalist, I have to sit on the outside, I have to take notes. But then I thought, you know what? If I participate in this session, even through my broken Arabic, I'm gonna learn more about what drama therapy is actually like and the influence it's gonna have on people's hearts and minds. So I went to this drama therapy session. It was conducted entirely in Arabic. I did my best to understand what was going on. And there were belly laughs, there were moments of joy, there were tears in the room, and I think that is really when I understood the impact of her storytelling. So I think to be a good storyteller who is also interviewing storytellers, you also have to involve yourself in the story. And that's what I think I tried to do by participating in that drama therapy session. So thank you for the question.
Hi, yes, my question's for Elisa. Your project really struck a chord with me. I think just the fact that I love that you found a story in your community, in your neighborhood. Also, I think a story that is very often overlooked. And I'm really curious, as someone who grew up in Brooklyn and has known likely people that are in these roles, like, what was it like to work with him on this project? And what kind of dynamic was that like? I feel like you also spoke to the local senator. There was so many levels of involvement happening. So I was just curious how you felt like that project was for you, and in terms of engaging with some of the people you were interviewing.
You guys could hear me, right? Okay. So for me, I personally just wanted to really focus on respecting the women and what they're doing. In the video, if you guys get a chance to see it, I go to La Parada and I record where they're working at, and so it was important to me to make sure that their faces aren't showing, to just respect who they are as individuals, because this is their life. As for speaking with the senator and people in the government position, my overall goal was to just understand how much do they know about what's going on and just what are they trying to do about the situation. And so just having that conversation with her was good.